Awesome. Folks, let's kick off. We were 3 minutes in here and we've got a lot of content to cover. It's good to meet all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join. I am Sarah. I lead the customer success team at Great Question. I'm filling in for Ned, our CEO and co-founder, who's unfortunately under the weather today. But our star of the hour is, of course, still here to join us and bless us with some knowledge on knowledge management. Um, it's a really big challenge in the research industry that I hear from customers all the time. Why so many research repositories miss the mark, and even more importantly, how to make sure that yours doesn't, that we have a repo that succeeds. To my mind, what I've heard as best practice from a number of different customers, a successful repository should be user-friendly, well organized, actively maintained, supporting collaboration throughout the org, provide accessible insights, and measurable long-term value. So to help us unpack this topic, I'm excited to be joined by Emily DiLeo, PhD, MLIS, lots of initials after that name, who's a knowledge management consultant and founder of The Current, where she is a knowledge management consultant. Also has a really unique background in anthropology and experience as an archivist and librarian. So Emily brings a really fresh perspective in my mind on how to integrate cross-disciplinary research to structuring research repositories and the important role of knowledge management itself in UX research. Just a housekeeping note, we love these to be collaborative, so please feel free to drop questions in the chat as Emily and I dig into this a little bit more, and we'll address them as we go throughout. So first off, thanks for being here, Emily.
Oh my gosh, you're very welcome. Hello from snowy Colorado, where it's 5 degrees Fahrenheit today.
That's pretty cold. I think
Pretty
it's about
chilly.
here in Toronto as well.
Okay.
For those here who don't know you though, you
Mhm.
do have that interesting perspective and background from before you entered the research space. Can you share a bit about your journey into knowledge management and what inspired you to start The Current?
Sure. So I came to UX about 4 years ago when things were blossoming and quite exciting.
Yeah.
Um, and I came from being an archivist in higher education. I was just looking to make a change actually during the pandemic and kind of with my career in general. And I saw UX research. I thought, well, yes, because I have this PhD and background in ethnography. Um, and as soon as I started to look around me and see what was going on in UX, I immediately gravitated toward the knowledge management problem that people were talking about. I was like, oh, well, I have a lot to say about this. um, so I started saying things, and folks were immediately like, oh, that's great. You're an ethnographer, but you're also a librarian. Like this, we need you. Like we need your help. So I worked for a few companies along the way, and then lots of layoffs happened, including me. And I was like, people still need this work. They still need to know these things. We still have these same kinds of questions about knowledge management, about repositories. So I'm going to consult, right? I'm going to consult.
Yeah.
I'm going to, keep teaching people about how to do this. So I started The Current.
That's awesome. What a cool trajectory and path to get into the space. And I understand you're going to be releasing a course soon on knowledge management for UX research. Can you share a bit more about
Yeah,
that?
yeah, thanks. It's released. It's ready to go. You can enroll.
Woohoo!
The first cohort starts at the beginning of March, March 3rd. And it's a 6-week course, and it's really about knowledge management strategy. So over the years in UX, I have learned that it's really not just about the repository, but it's the whole strategy that you bring to it. And so this course covers that, including like adoption, like stakeholder management, then kind of principles of knowledge management that I think are really important, regardless of the tooling that you use. So I'm super excited about it. I used to be a college professor, so I feel kind of back in my element a little bit with this. Yeah.
Fabulous. Oh, that's so exciting. I'll definitely check that out. Now into the nitty-gritty Q&A time. So we're going to split this out into three sections, folks. First, let's go ahead and define the repository for a little while. Then we're going to explore the role of knowledge management and how it relates to democratization. And our final section will be about how to ensure success in building out a research repository. We'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A at the end, guys, but let's dig into the first section here in defining a repository. So I hear this from customers all the time. A lot of organizations maybe have difficulty or aren't setting the right expectations internally with what a repository can and cannot do. So in your view, Emily, what should a research repository be?
Well, that's a very good question. I've written a lot about this. I've thought a lot about it. Um, I will say quickly to start that for an archivist, the term repository actually refers to a specific physical place, like where something is kept. So at the beginning, when I first came to UX, I was like, why are we using this term? It's just kind of odd to me that it was being used. And as I wrote in a blog post recently, like repository has come to mean so many different things that the term has become a little bit meaningless, because it's really whatever, it should be for you. Um, I think kind of what you said at the beginning, like what a repository should do for you are those things that you mentioned, right? Where it's like, uh, it should be a place where you can organize your assets. It should be, or it can be, a place where other folks can access materials. Access is a big knowledge management and library science term. Um, so those are really the biggest things about it. And there's a lot more to say, and for both of those, especially the access part, that I think a repository should be doing. Yeah, I'll stop there because I could also talk about the trajectory of like how repositories start. Maybe I'll just say that really quick. I think folks think what usually happens is like, oh my gosh, I can't find anything.
Right.
That's usually how things start. I am having trouble finding things. Everything is a mess. We need a repository. And usually my answer is you actually need a knowledge management strategy first, right? You have to know kind of what you're dealing with first. Yeah.
And so talk to me about that a little bit. Like we see all the time, there's this tension that you kind of just alluded to between organization and visibility, right? Like it should be organized, but
Yeah.
that's meaningless if it's not accessible. So maybe you can talk about that tension and how it relates to
Yes.
starting with a knowledge management strategy.
Yes. I'm gonna answer this poll and then um so this is where I think there has been it's a kind of problematic area because organization and visibility are two very different goals. And those goals are also something that librarians think about all the time, every day, right? Like how do we best organize this material? How do we get this material to people, right? And I think it's really imperative, especially now that we're a few years into this repository journey, that you think about those goals separately. Um, it is probably unlikely that you are going to find a tool that will achieve both of those things for you. And I'm looking at this. Ooh, storage space. Let me just move this to the side and then I'll respond to this poll, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Because the adoption piece is such a hurdle. And what I
Mm,
will say about that adoption, I mean, making it accessible is one thing. Getting people to use it is another, right? We all know this, I think, at this point. I think at the beginning, folks were like, but we built this great thing, but why aren't people using it? Librarians did this like 50 years ago, at least, and just like, why aren't people coming to the library? How do we get people to come to the library and use this material? So, librarians know this struggle very, very well, which is why I was always a little bit, for my very first job, which I was hired to help them choose a tool. I chose a tool that wasn't a UX research repository tool for them, because we did a bunch of research with the researchers, with the designers and product managers, and I saw organization isn't your issue. Research visibility is your issue, right? Let's talk about organization in another conversation, but this is the real issue that's holding you back. I suggested this knowledge platform, knowledge sharing platform for them, which wasn't a research tool, wasn't created for UX, but I was like, this is the best thing to use to get it out there, right? And that's fine. So to kind of circle back with the loop about what is a research repository, it really depends on what your goal is right now for you. I think everybody has the goal of that visibility, but to me, that comes at the end when your research maturity has increased such that you can make it visible, you can push research out to stakeholders using a platform or using some kind of strategy that meets those stakeholders where they are. But if your research isn't ready to be pushed out, you've got to get there first. So it's also very, it's very much in lockstep with research maturity, which I've been thinking about recently too, which is very interesting.
Gotcha.
To think about.
Let's take a look at the whole. What stood out to me immediately, then I'll pass it to you, Emily, is I'm a little bit surprised about the rate of number 1 and number 3 here, where it's not being used so much for analysis or sharing insights across team. It seems like most folks are focusing on using it as a storage space or potentially all of the above, but would love your thoughts.
Yeah. So, okay, why don't I talk about the storage space? So, as an archivist, an archive, and this isn't the way we think about this in UX researching, corporate, whatever, okay. But for an archivist, the archive is gold. The archive is where all these answers to your questions are. They're where you can go back in history and you can find out things we didn't know before. And I can tell lots of stories about crazy things I found in archives. But you should think about your research storage space like that, like an archive. I was working with a client recently who they had 20 years of research in their SharePoint. Wow. And I said, whoa, okay. And kind of just like, with something like that, you can't quite find what you're looking for, and you're just thinking that is this annoyance. I'm like, no, this is your gold mine here. Like, you need to get in there and be able to like look around you, and whatever tool you choose to organize your assets has to allow you to be able to go into that archive and look around and see what you have, right? AI can kind of do that if it's set up properly. Kind of not. It depends. But that's so right. I would not call it a storage space, but like, yeah, these are your assets, right? These are your business assets, right? You should treat them as such. Let's look at some of the all of the above. That's the one I chose, of course. We don't have a repository yet, but we're considering one. Yeah, you should. Yeah, so I will speak to this analysis utilizing insights and tags. So I think, research tools like Great Question are really great for democratization efforts, right? So that's a great repository choice, I think, because you've got all those analysis tools in there. I think I've seen some teams who kind of already have their analysis stuff all set. They just need the actual repository. So it's just, it's a different use case. There's so many different use cases for repositories.
100%.
Yeah.
All right, let's go into the next question here. Why do you think, so with that, again, circling back to the organization versus visibility aspect of things, why do you think some repositories fail? You were talking about that adoption gap, right? So in terms of promoting that visibility and giving folks access to that gold mine and actually seeing it used, why do you think some repositories are failing with that?
Well, there are a lot. I'm going to speak about kind of failure is, again, failure to reach stakeholders. Again, please listen to that because that's really what you're going for here, is reaching your stakeholders. And I think that is, you don't have a strategy, right? You've adopted a tool. We don't need a strategy. We just need this tool. No, you need a strategy. You need to have an adoption strategy. You need to have, this is where, someone on your ops team or a knowledge management or librarian, whatever, comes into play, which we'll talk about later what that entails. But
Mm,
my just in the work that I do, I think people kind of assume, oh, you're a knowledge management consultant, you build libraries. And I'm like, actually, no, I do like 80% of it is people work, right? 20%, because there are so many great tools out there. Use a tool if you can, right? It makes things easier. But you have to do all the work to figure out what tool is going to get you where you want to go. And you have to figure out where you want to go. That's hard, right? Because there are so many challenges in knowledge management. It's not just being able to find things, right? Like search and find is super basic, but I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who have that issue, right? Um, and now I've gone straight, off the rails here. Bring me back, Sarah.
I was gonna just to cap off the definition of a repo, as we saw in the poll.
Okay.
A bunch of folks here don't have a repository yet. And so
Yeah.
get back to this strategy you're just alluding to, is that the first step they should be taking towards implementing a repository,
Yeah.
is thinking through a knowledge management strategy?
Good question. Yes, and more specifically, so I called my business The Current because I'm an ethnographer. When I go in and work with companies, with clients, I survey the landscape. I find the what I call currents of knowledge that already exist. People are smart. They make their own systems. If you don't have a repository, you actually do. It just doesn't look like maybe you want it to look, right? So the
Mhm.
way that I work and the way that I would suggest people work, especially if you're a UX researcher, it comes natural, is you survey that landscape. You find out who are your stakeholders. You do some stakeholder mapping, which is part of my course as well. Like do some stakeholder mapping. You have like honest conversations with yourself or with your team about like who are these stakeholders? Who are the champions of our research? Who are the blockers? How do we do the strategic relationship building, which I think is super important to make sure that this repository works. So it's a big undertaking. It's, as you can already tell, it's a lot more than knowledge management. So my advice would be to look at your landscape now. Look at your knowledge management landscape now. What does it look like?
Got
So,
it. And we have a great on that note, we have a great question from Sarah in the chat here. For folks who might be earlier in that maturity journey, so maybe lower maturity or a distributed democratized team where there's a research team of one and designers or product managers doing a bunch of research. Do you start with the simpler or most basic elements of knowledge management in that case? And how do you provide guidance and get buy-in when you don't have that research team to support you?
yeah, that's a very good question. I have worked with a team of one before. Um, I think Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. I'm just kind of going to assume that the research maturity that you're just kind of starting off. And really, then it's really about capturing, especially with democratized research, where you have lots of folks doing research. You need a system that captures what they're doing effectively. And this is part of knowledge management, right? It's capturing not just the customer insights that make it into um, the report or into whatever system people are putting it into, but making sure all that tacit knowledge, right? Like what people are learning in their heads, especially folks that are just starting out doing this, they're going to have all sorts of ideas and insights they may not be writing down. That is what I would do with that kind of environment. Make sure you're capturing all the knowledge and that it is going somewhere that it can be organized. Yeah,
Good.
especially if you're a team of one.
So starting with capturing an organization and then think through the visibility later once we've got the basics down. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would say this is the issue, right? Like the other part of the strategy that I've been kind of experimenting with and thinking about a lot is how to achieve that visibility early on while you're building maturity. Because I
Mm,
know when people hear that, they're like, oh Lord, well, that's like 2 or 3 years away at this point, right? To get that mature.
yeah.
But there are ways to do that. And I think we need to think outside of the box, think outside of just the research report of ways to be like, because you will, right? You will start capturing really interesting, valuable insights from the get-go, right? You just, you have to find a way to package those up and deliver them to stakeholders to say, look, see, look, the work we're doing is really super valuable. You have to deliver that value right away. Um, one of my I had this conversation with a consultant who's not in UX at all. And she said, she told me she did like a research summary, like a company asked her to go back into their customer research and write up this kind of summary report kind of thing. I was like, oh, that's a really good idea for folks who maybe have a lower research maturity but have a lot of research material, find out what matters to the business right now, and then go back in your archive and find all the things related to that. Package them up in a way that makes sense for stakeholders and deliver them right to them.
Love that. And with that in mind, we're going to go into our second kind of section here, Emily, which is really around the role of knowledge management in that democratization. So we're talking a lot about stakeholder engagement and making sure that these other teams can have visibility. If you're starting out either with low research maturity or trying to get that visibility cross-departmentally, that democratization really hinges on building relationships with the non-research teams. So how can you start fostering these relationships to make those repositories more impactful?
Yeah, good question. So one thing, one of the reasons why I like starting, or whether that's how I work, that I start with a client by looking at what their landscape looks like. I also look at relationships, right? Because someone's already doing knowledge management. Always, I find someone has it front of mind, right? Same thing with relationships. Like a research team may just be getting going, but they may not realize, oh, well, yeah, I have coffee with this designer all the time. We talk about
Mm,
XYZ. Or one researcher said to me, well, yeah, this one staker always comes to me to ask if we have research on XYZ. I'm like, that's a relationship. You already have, I would be shocked to find an organization who already didn't have relationships like that, right? And so, because that's how people get work done, right? Like people are super smart. They're just like, oh, well, I need to get this thing done. I'm going to build a relationship with this person on this other team, right? And then you're like, oh, okay, that's a current of knowledge right there, right?
mm,
How do we leverage that relationship that you already have? So,
right. I love that. The current that flows through the whole
yeah,
organization, right? Like the
that's
current.
it. Yeah.
I just got there. I just got it.
Okay, good, good.
That's awesome. And talking about that expertise and like the role of knowledge management in particular, what does the knowledge manager persona look like? A lot of orgs don't have the luxury of having someone with the title knowledge manager on staff. So what is that persona or the role that someone can adopt as a knowledge manager?
Hmm. Yes. I'm going to leave those poll results up there. We can talk about that after this. The knowledge manager at an org. So it's interesting we talk about this, right? Because if you know knowledge management, which is a strange like sister field to library science, but they hardly ever cross over like in real life. But knowledge managers usually sit in IT, right? And they have usually a different kind of skill set. Um, and so I think it's wonderful, actually, and super advantageous that UX is seeing a need for knowledge management in their teams, because that's just super smart. So that someone, who's very specialized in that way. But I think the persona is going to be someone who knows about qualitative research, right? You don't have to have a PhD in it, but you have to know like what are your researchers doing. And I have to say, like pretty much all the ops people I've ever met, all the research ops people, they have those chops. You just need to know a little bit more about knowledge management principles. But all of that other stuff, the building relationships, the strategic work, um, like ops folks are sometimes the only ones who know what's going on across teams. They often have this very like strategic positioning. Um, as Kate Towsey writes about, in her book, like that is your person, right? A member of the ops team. And that's, kind of why I created the course too, because I was like, well, not a lot of companies are hiring librarians or one person to do this one thing. So let's train up people, so that we can also, have that. That's always been a part of research operations. Um, of course, some people don't have an ops team. I just worked with a client who doesn't have an ops team at all, right? And I feel like, I think half the people on my course wait list are UX researchers. And I mean, that's fine too. Like I said before a few minutes ago, like there are folks that have this what I call knowledge management mindset. They're the ones who are always like, wait, did you write that down? Or wait a minute, let me organize our SharePoint files. Or, the one who always is thinking of that stuff. And I'm like, you're the person. Just need, let's just talk and let's, train up a little bit and there you go.
And it sounds like the folks in the room here could benefit from a little bit of someone taking on that persona, since the answer to the only 11% of folks said that their teams, broader teams, actively use and contribute to their repositories. So, what are your thoughts on that, Emily? Are you surprised at all by these responses?
No, no, I'm not. It's a real, I think I've seen some teams who have been like, we're literally going to put our research in Jira, or we're going to put our research in product board just to make sure it's like right in front of people's faces. Yeah, that's a great instinct. I'd be curious to know if anyone maybe here has done that, like how it works, um, how it's worked out for you. But again, think of the engagement as a separate strategy from your organization. You organize these stuff, you make it findable, searchable, discoverable. But the part where you're pushing it out, like I'm saying, pushing it out, and like I said, people are not going to come. They just aren't. I don't know a lot about product managers, but I know that they're super busy, and the last thing they want to do is go to another database and try and figure out how to find something. It's really hard. You have to meet people where they are and find out and just create that strategy based on what you know, right? This is what user researchers do. That's the good news, right? Is that you already have the tools and the mindset to do this. of course, you have the bias because you work with these people every day. But yeah, that's the good news.
Awesome. Last question here for you on the role of the knowledge manager. So folks, if you have any other questions about this, oh, Ray, I'm gonna rip into this instead. This is an off the cuff question. Ray wants to know, how can I meet people where they are? Jira is where her folks are, with my external repository and not double a ton of my efforts.
Mm, yeah, that is another, that's kind of another issue. I would want to ask and keep it accurate and synchronous. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think you have
Great
to,
question. Get it?
oh dear. It's still morning time for us. Um, I would say you may have to double your effort. You may have to, right? It's kind of like the same issue of, as an archivist, my archivist brain would say, put all your assets in this safe place, in this storage space. Then take out some of it, take a copy out, and then use it for strategy, right? So yeah, you're touching it twice. You are kind of doubling it, the effort. But I think that just might be something you will have to do sometimes, especially with this visibility issue.
And is that constant though, Emily? Like is it short-term pain, long-term gain? Like double your efforts at
Yes.
the beginning to set it up and then see it
Yes,
scale from there?
for sure. For sure. Not to mention that the other thing is, um, you're going to switch tooling, or your company's going to switch tooling a lot, and you want to be able to do that very easily. That's a totally another topic, but that is kind of related in terms of that double work, and that kind of headache.
Got it. And what about keeping it accurate and synchronous? Any thoughts on that portion?
Yeah, that depends what your external repository tool is. Um, of course, I would probably say, choose something that integrates with Jira, and then you'll say, "Oh, but ours doesn't do that. Oh, I have to switch tools again."
Yeah.
I think that's just kind of name of the game at this point.
Got it. Okay. And then Sarah's got a question here. What in the basics, what does a knowledge management strategy look like? Like what components does it include at a high level? I'm sure we could do an entire webinar on this topic in particular,
Yeah,
but maybe
yeah,
just
that's the course, right? That's a course. Yeah, the strategy looks like kind of assessment, right? So you're assessing your knowledge management terrain. I'm looking at the mountains terrain.
Oh yeah.
You're you're also looking at your problem space. You could be, surveying folks or even doing interviews with folks about, how knowledge management works to really get a good understanding what exists now. Um, then you are really going to, I think about those knowledge management principles and what are we achieving? Are we achieving organization? Are we achieving access? Are we achieving visibility? Which is the most important thing to do right now. Usually you want to go with organization first, like get your house in order first, I usually recommend. But then how do you quickly prove value, even at the beginning of that strategy, right? With something like a research summary. Um, and then you kind of set up your uh, kind of communication strategy and kind of like round up the folks who are going to help you with this because this is a lot of work, right? And then
Mhm.
you just kind of chart out what makes the most sense. I think um, for a client recently, I kind of said that, okay, let's get your house in order. We're going to prove early value. Um, then we are going to go to access or possibly choosing a knowledge management, like a platform, knowledge platform or kind of knowledge base, like depending on what you found about your stakeholders, if they would access a knowledge base, right? How amenable they are to that.
Gotcha. That's awesome. And there's a couple more questions in the chat here that I think lead us perfectly well to go into our last section on ensuring success. So, starting from a strong standpoint and building out future scalable success in the repository. Um, if knowledge, so another one from Sarah here, if knowledge management doesn't exist in your company, how do you get buy-in into that strategy? So we've gone
Yeah.
through these sections that you just shared. How do we get buy-in and start from a successful initial footing?
Yeah. So on my website, I do have like a free download that I created from the very beginning. ROI of knowledge management is it's a bit basic, but it gives you these, the big ways in which knowledge management, I mean, effective knowledge management increases your ROI, right? You're minimizing data loss. You're not losing information when people leave. And this stuff has been documented probably for decades by the knowledge management community. And you can find these statistics pretty easily in like big reports. I quote a couple of them in my download. But fortunately, there's lots of statistics out there. You could even um, you could even do an assessment, which is something I've done for companies, just a simple assessment, and say, here's where you're losing money, here's where you're losing data, here's where you're losing time. Here's where researchers are spending a ton of time they don't need to spend. And then you literally deliver it and say, look, if we did this, this, and this, right?
Gotcha.
So,
That makes sense. And then a little bit more specifically, visually, this is a question from Rachel. Visually, what's been successful for you and your clients in sharing repository information?
wow, visually, well, okay, man, I have a real chip on my shoulder about design. So I'm not a designer, but um, do you mean research by repository info?
Let's start with the assets themselves. Yes, the repository information.
Oh, okay, just like in like what's inside, like sharing research. I think it's really kind of connecting your research again to KPIs, to like what product the company's interested in at the moment, in AI, right? That's a big topic. You can say, actually, we've done all this related research to AI and automation. Here it
Mhm.
is. Here is this thing. And I have seen knowledge platforms. You can use knowledge platforms, knowledge bases to do this. You can set it up by like, you can actually tag your knowledge or your kind of curated research by the organization, like the business objectives of the moment, and say AI, and then your stakeholder be like, oh, okay, here's a bunch of stuff on AI. Oh, here's a bunch of stuff on, this automation thing we're working about, or, and they can actually, you create a searchable knowledge base that's based on what they want to look for, right? That's just for your stakeholders.
Right. We've got a couple other suggestions in here in the chat from
Yeah.
Ray. Unsolicited UX briefs in Slack, a short PowerPoint with UX KPIs, high level sentiment and recommendations, which is fantastic. Going into my next question for you, Emily, related to these measurements and KPIs that we're starting to allude to here, how can teams measure the impact of their research repository? And that, again, in itself could be an entire webinar subject, but some
Yeah.
tactical advice that you might have there as a starting point.
Yeah. I think you should measure it based on the value that is perceived by your stakeholders. Your stakeholders may not care that your repository got 100 visits in the last week, right? You have to pinpoint what it is that they would care to know, right? And then you track that thing, right? I think usage statistics are fine. I think a lot of tools will gather that for you, but getting into the nuts and bolts, again, that's relationship building. because yeah, it can be super hard to track what happens to your research after somebody looks at it. I don't know, in a big organization, like people just don't know. And I'm like, whoa, that's so weird that you spend all this time and effort, you have no idea what happened afterwards. So again, it's that relationship building, it's gathering stories, which is you know, what we're really good at, right? Finding those things that matter. And that's super strategic work. And it's, again, it's part of knowledge management, but it's also part of, ops. So,
Gotcha. I'll share one little quick story from a customer
yeah,
recently. One way that they've measured the success of their repository is the amount of shipped, and it's a software company, an amount of shipped feature improvements or feature requests that can be tied back to specific research insights. So they use a repository to match up their tickets, so the engineering tickets, with their research findings. And when those improvements get shipped, they get a notification that their research was involved in shipping that fix. And so they're looking to see an increase in the number of shipped
yeah,
improvements over time, of course, that are related back to research. Just one idea of many that I'm sure the whole crowd here has and how to make that a
yeah.
little bit more tangible.
Yeah, that's super smart because, I mean, just to be, play into a stereotype here, I think that stakeholders pay more attention to quantitative results
Mhm.
tracking, as we know very well. So yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah, one thing I hear all the time in my own reporting in my job is lines, not dots. So it's something that we want to
Uh,
see change over time, right? It's like the percentage increases versus just a number of views on a given month.
yeah.
And Emily, you've alluded to AI a couple times throughout this conversation. What about the use of AI in knowledge management? Like, what opportunities does AI uncover for teams, and what are the risks we need to keep in mind here?
I'm going to mark excited about the role of AI for me. So let me tell you, first of all, search and find. Intelligent search, you have to have it. You really do. I think it's not the gold standard. It's just pretty basic. Like that I think more than anything, the intelligent search changes the landscape of knowledge management, right? That you can have like a body of unorganized data and find a needle in a haystack, right? As long as it's set up well, right? That's fantastic. Um, I think same thing with kind of like automatic tagging can work really well. Maybe there's a little bit more room for error there, depending on how the models are trained. They have to be like really trained well, and someone needs to, be able to discern, um, before you purchase a tool or use something, like how well it's working or what kind of technology they're using, what kind of algorithms they're using, um, to make that work. So um, I'm actually writing a blog post right now about AI and knowledge management that I'll publish in probably a couple of weeks. Um, and I mean, sorry, I'm getting distracted by reading the poll results. Um, and I think the basic thing is to, like we've heard so many times, AI can make us more efficient, can save a lot of time. I will tell you, I hate cataloging. I'm a librarian and I hate cataloging. That's the worst thing, right? Cataloging for librarians, if you don't know, you take a book, there are rules, it's very strict. You have to choose certain classification headings determined by the Library of Congress. And if you choose the wrong one, like someone will, you get in trouble. Like, I hate cataloging. So for me, it was no surprise that people didn't like to tag their own research. I'm like, oh. Well, of course they don't like to tag. Nobody likes that. Like, so try to use automatic tagging and find a system, find a tool that does a good job with it, that trains the AI well and very thoroughly with lots and lots of data that's correctly classified. And I think the more that that AI is trained well, the better obviously it's going to work, and that it's set up to continually get smarter and improve on the tagging structure. You still, but again, like this, like AI has potential answer. Even if you do automatic tagging, it's not just like, oh, we're going to press a button and do it. You still have to think about your taxonomy. You still have to feed it a taxonomy that you want it to use, right? You still have to make those decisions. So the strategy is still on us, right? The strategy. And what the last thing I'll say about that is what is just kind of annoying to me about this stuff. That I mean, I love technology, but it's kind of like when something new and shiny comes out, it kind of distracts our gaze from the strategic work at hand. Okay. So it's like, oh my God, like look what this tool can do. We don't need this thing anymore. I'm like, come back to me. You still need a strategy. This AI tool solves for this problem. I was listening to a webinar the other day. They were using a new AI tool, and she said, this has been so great, but it only solves for one of our knowledge management challenges. Correct. Right. So stay away from that magic bullet thinking, because it's just distracting you from the work.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've got a lot of customer stories to share on this, but I'll share
Oh,
just
yeah.
quickly as well. One customer in particular, they have a democratized research org. So they've got their core research team, but they have people who do research. So PMs and designers doing some of that research as well. And they always call AI the starting point. It's a great place to start, but it should never be the final product of that
Yeah.
research. Especially because, and I saw in the poll as well, it's great for discoverability and finding those things, but the risk that this customer in particular is most afraid of is that they use the AI to validate their judgments going into the research. So instead of doing the research to answer an open-ended question and find out how to attack the problem, they have an assumption about how the problem should be tackled, and they use the AI to validate those assumptions. And that's the biggest fear that I'm hearing from this customer in particular. So, any thoughts about, and back with the poll, the vast majority of folks were either excited about the efficiencies it could bring, but the same amount were excited, but sure that they need guardrails. So any ideas
Yeah.
about those guardrails? There we go. Thanks, Carly.
Oh my gosh. Well, I should qualify everything I just said about AI. I'm talking about AI and knowledge management. AI and UX research is something that I have not thought through thoroughly, although I am super, I am super skeptical because I'm an ethnographer, right? Like, yeah, of course it can. I've used it to, like, find themes and interviews and things like that. And I like that, using it as a starting point, but not an end point. Um, because bias is baked into the cake with
Yeah.
AI. It really is. So it's going to be wonky, and it always is. What's super exciting to me is, like, someday when I have time, I'm going to build my own library with ChatGPT and build my own bot so that I can be like, ooh, I'm only going to put the good stuff in here.
Right. Yeah.
Then I'm going to look for answers to it in here because I have curated this. It's not just like all the garbage on the internet, or whatever your system that you set up to get rid of the garbage doesn't work 100%, blah, blah, blah. Um, so I would say I'm looking at the options cautiously. I'm somewhere between cautiously optimistic and skeptical when it comes to research itself. Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Two last quick questions for me, Emily, then we'll go back to the audience's questions. There's a couple good ones in there. We're talking about this a little bit. Where do tools assist in enabling effective knowledge management? We were just talking about those pitfalls a little bit. So could you
Yeah.
sum up your thoughts on how tools can help enable effective knowledge management?
Well, certainly to organize information. And again, yeah, those tools are great. And of course, AI, anytime you're dealing with like a ton of information or you're trying to work with a lot of stuff, like always look into, yeah, the AI, like using AI. I know not a lot of, not everyone can use it according, for their companies and everything. Um, but yes, and then, the other tools. I mean, obviously for disseminating communication, I mean, those are pretty well set and everybody has those, whether it's Teams or Slack or whatnot.
Yeah.
But again, it's this like this knowledge platform, kind of fuzzy, kind of like, on the horizon here where I'm like, oh yeah, look at that knowledge platform that's like the UI is beautiful and it's like super interesting to use and it looks like Spotify or whatever. Like that's interesting to me in terms of tools for you still have that problem possibly with adoption. So that would only work with certain um, situations. However, my like pie in the sky kind of dream, which I think would work for some organizations, and I think I've heard people talk about before, is to have all customer research in a knowledge base, not just UX, not just marketing, not just voice of the customer, but everything in one place so that folks would definitely use that, right? Because it's really just, it's centralized. So hard to centralize, but if you can do it, super effective.
Love
Yeah.
that. Centralization is definitely key. My last question for you, then we'll go to the audience. Hopefully, this is a quick one. If you could give one piece of advice to the folks here who are trying to turn their repository into a strategic asset, what would it be?
Mm, I would say to get really familiar with the business. Get familiar with the business. I think um, I talked in a design ops summit a few months ago with Maria Taylor. We talked about reframing US assets as business assets. That would be my advice. Like reframe that whole thing because I think what has happened is, and I'm still a relative outsider, I think, so I can kind of see that UX has been in this silo for a long time, and you have to think about it differently. We have to think about UX research differently, reframe like what a business asset is and how you can really connect to the business. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Emily. All right. First one up here we've got from Sarah. Is there a repository that's for the research team only, including things like skeletons, drafts, versus a space where you find the outputs? So a repository for inputs versus outputs, since
Uh-huh.
non-research folk don't normally care about nuts and bolts.
Yeah, I will say I kind of like that idea because once again, that would help you separate these goals of organization, search and find from pushing research out, right? It's like, instead of like dragging someone into the library and showing them like all these crazy stacks of books, you're walking out the door to them with this book that they really want to read. And you walk out the door and you meet them in front and you're like, here's the book you were looking for, right? So yes, if you can, I know it seems like a lot of work, but it's like correct. Non-research people don't care about nuts and bolts. Exactly. So that's why another kind of knowledge management principle that I talk about, which comes more from archival management, is curation.
Yeah.
All of you already do this already, right? You curate your research, you decide what's good and bad. Um, but that's super, super important skill. And that's where that comes in handy. Yeah.
Awesome. I think we've got time for one or two more here. So Eric wants to know about managing PII or personal
Oh,
information, personal data. How do you have you
mm,
implemented something to solve for leakage of this in the past? They ask for de-identified versions of files, but some slips through the cracks. And part two, how do you balance minimizing access to that PII with driving adoption and visibility?
yeah. So when I came early on, when I came into this space, I was like, wait a minute, you're putting raw data in the same place that you're putting your research reports? That was confusing to me. Again, from an archivist librarian mind, like I would not mix those two things together. Um, just from an information organization point of view. But I know that that's not realistic for a lot of folks. Um, I have not implemented, and I have not built something myself or to minimize this personal data. I know that a lot of repository tools help you do that, and maybe Sarah, you can talk about that too. Um,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different obfuscation strategies out there. We minimize access to PII by tagging certain critical details as being PII, and there's more to come on our roadmap for that in the future, but would love to double click on that separately. Um, we had a question from Bobby about best practices. Unfortunately, we're at time. So, Bobby, I would suggest reaching out to Emily in her course or separately on LinkedIn, maybe just to summarize. But we'll be sharing out the recording from this, covering all the best practices that Emily shared today. Emily, thank you so much for joining us and for sharing your wealth of knowledge on
oh, of
archiving
course.
and knowledge management with us today.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure, and lots came out of the chat.
Yeah, you're very welcome. And please do, everyone, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, ask me questions. I answer questions all the time because we're always interested to know, hear people's stories and know what they want to know. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. Take care, everyone. Hope you
Bye.
enjoyed and chat with you all soon.